And welcome back everyone. It's been a while since I've made a video, but today I wanted to show you one of the brilliant games which is kind of making headlines in the world now, a game by Richard Rapport where he won against Praggnanandhaa. It was, I think, 2 days ago in the Chess Cup super tournament in Uzbekistan. And it was just an absolutely brilliant game. And for those of you who haven't seen it before, I wanted to show it. And for those of you who have seen it before, maybe I can still show you some nice analysis from this game, which might be useful to you. So the game I'm talking about, as I said, Richard Rapport had the black pieces against Praggnanandhaa with white. And it was just really beautiful. So I'm not gonna spoil too much. We're just gonna go right into it. So Pragg played d4 and Rapport went for the King's Indian defense. On a note right here, I am still working on the VIP video for all of my supporters on the King's Indian. I know I've been saying that it's gonna be released soon. Maybe I'm gonna be able to record it this month, but the latest is gonna be next month. So this is my promise, which surely I'm gonna hold. So we see the King's Indian right here. Pragg went for f3. The idea in general of going f3 is kind of to avoid the Grunfeld, which I'm sure that, well, most likely Rapport anyway doesn't play. He plays the King's Indian quite often. But the point is that if black would go for this move d5 here, then at least after e4, black does not have this idea to capture on c3, which typically black would like to do in the Grunfeld. This line is also not bad at all for black. It's like super complicated. Black goes knight b6, bishop g7, castle. Later on has some ideas to break the center with f5. It's also super complicated, but at least some white players are arguing that you're just avoiding this typical Grunfeld structure after knight takes e3. But Rapport goes for bishop g7, e4, d6, knight c3, short castle. Now knight e2 was played. And here is the first interesting moment that Rapport goes for this move a6. I would like to briefly point out some of the details here when it comes to move orders. In general, black mostly plays this move c5. It's kind of the main move typically, which then often leads to those Benoni type of structures with d5. I think that, well, mostly the idea by playing knight e2 instead of bishop e3, what also might have been Pragg's idea, is that now if black goes e6, this bishop is not on e3 just yet, and white has the option at least to go bishop g5, which might be a little bit more annoying for black to face. And if h6 comes, then white even has some ideas to often retreat with the bishop and then later on to hit this pawn on h6 in some cases. Even though you still need to be careful, like there are some lines like this where bishop takes h6 is actually not a threat because black has this idea of knight takes e4, and if white takes, then there's queen h4. So this is one idea which you need to keep in mind here. But in general, this inclusion of h6 probably favors white in most of the cases. But also there are some downside if you start with knight e2, which is, well, that the knight is already there. If you go bishop e3, now if black would go a6, which Rapport did, then white is not necessarily going to play knight e2, but instead could go for something like queen d2 and then an immediate h4 and h5. And also Rapport's idea, which he played in a game with b5, is probably going to be less efficient here because then after takes, the bishop can take on b5, which is going to be a much better version than if white would need to capture like with the knight, as it could have happened in the game. But Pragg started with knight e2. As I said, my guess is kind of to have more ideas against this c5 line. Even though actually with the black pieces after bishop e3, c5, I was always a bit annoyed by this line. In general, I'm personally always kind of materialistic and you need to give up this pawn. I think the line goes something like this, which is very, very much okay for black because you get all of these dark squares. The bishop on g7 is going to get very active. Those knights are often jumping around to e5, b6, bishop a6 is often coming. But white is a pawn up for the moment, and in some cases it's not so easy, at least for me, to generate enough compensation. So I still need to think what to recommend here, also for my chess-based course, which is gonna come out hopefully this year still on the King's Indian. But anyway, that's another question. So in the game, knight e2 happened, a6, bishop e3, and now knight bd7. Pragg played queen d2 and now this move b5, which I actually already played in, I think it was 2020 against the Italian Grandmaster Basso Pierluigi. And back then it was still quite a fresh idea, but nowadays I think it's quite well known, and Pragg was actually quite well prepared, but I think that Rapport was even better prepared. I'm honestly not quite sure how long Richie was in prep, but anyway, his play was absolutely brilliant. We're going to see it in a second. So the point of b5 in general is just to generate counterplay as soon as possible. Otherwise, white has these dangerous plans by pushing h4, h5, and bishop h6, and very often just checkmating black on the king side. So black really needs to play actively as soon as possible. Pragg now went for the move h4, which is also quite interesting. My game went bishop h6, which my opponent played back then. It was some closed round-robin Grandmaster tournament. Back then I played the move b4, which I briefly checked now, and it's still holding up quite well, at least objectively speaking. I also saw that e5 was possible, but I think I even prepared this line back then. My game went knight d5, bishop takes h6, takes, and now c5. And later on we got some pretty strange position, h5, queen g7, where strategically speaking black is doing quite well, because this bishop is kind of a weak piece in the long run because so many pawns are on the light squares. But of course I also have some weaknesses like the d6 square. My king is theoretically a bit weak, but objectively it was around balanced. After queen d2 I went a5. The game later on ended in a draw, but black is definitely not worse here. Another line which I want to point out is that, whoops, if white captures on b5 here, which is quite logical, just taking the pawn on b5. And this is what I was saying before. If the knight is still on g1, then white would be able to capture now with the bishop, which would be a much better version for white. Because after knight takes b5, now black has c6, the knight has to go back to c3, and now black strikes in the center with e5. And this line is actually quite dangerous for white, and also objectively black is doing very well here. I copied in 2 games which went wrong for white pretty quickly. There was one Jan Krzysztof Duda game with white against Chigaev. Duda played rook c1, and I just wanted to show how Chigaev played because it was very thematic. He went d5, e takes d5, so black really wants to break in the center right away because the king on e1 is always a bit weak. e5 happened, take everything, and now b3, and it still looks like white is fairly solid, but this king is just not getting out on e1. It was rook e8, take on e5, knight e5, king f2, and now a very nice move by Chigaev, this move d4. And white is already lost because there are just too many threats. If knight takes d4, I think there was often this idea with knight g4. We might see that in another game. And if take here, there was this idea with rook e3 quite often. And black is just winning because bishop d4 is winning too much material. In the game, it was bishop takes d4. Now rook takes a2, which was also a very nice idea. I guess that if queen takes a2, then knight d3 is just winning everything. Knight c1 is coming, bishop d4. Also, the king is probably going to get checkmated. I mean, it's just mate in one here. So this is just over. Rook c2 was played in the game, knight g4 check, and Chigaev won quite nicely. So white is just getting checkmated. That was a pretty cool game. Another game went d takes e5. This was like an online game, which I also wanted to briefly show. Again, this d5 idea, take everything. And here we also saw this idea with knight g4 in this game. After takes, now rook takes e3, and black is winning and also won in just a few more moves. So just to point out that this cb5 is quite dangerous for white, actually. So that's why Pragg went h4, and h5 was played, just stopping h5 from the white side, and now long castle. So now we're entering really double-edged territory. Rapport went e5 and now d5. And this is the first not the first quite interesting position, but the first one which is almost out of theory here. There was still one Basso game, so Basso Pierluigi is staying loyal to this line, which is also understandable. I mean, white has quite a big center. And typically black went for this move b takes c4, which was also played in one correspondence game. But in that correspondence game from the year 2019, white in fact won. And the move knight b1 is probably quite strong here, and I'm assuming also what Pragg intended to play. It was also played by Basso in one game. I'm quite sure that he was familiar with this correspondence game. The idea is that white wants to develop the knight from e2 to c3 and the knight from b1 now to a3 to win back this pawn on c4. So this is quite an impressive plan, which I don't think anyone would find over the board, honestly. Like, it's quite difficult, but a nice idea to remember. So Basso's game went knight b6 here by black, and then white actually had a fantastic position here after f5, take everything, and now the king on c1 is fairly safe, and black is stuck with this weakness on c7 basically forever, and black just doesn't really have any play on the king side. So here white is much better. Instead, what's better, what was also played in correspondence, was this move knight c5. In general, black is not really scared that white takes here, because then this bishop is at some moment probably going to go to h6, and all the dark squares are just very weak. Also, this knight could then go to d6 in some cases, so black generally is not so scared here of this trade. The correspondence game went knight c3, now knight d3 check, and this position felt fairly playable for me, because black does have this pretty strong light squared bishop, but it's not really getting out at the moment. And after knight a3, knight h7, the correspondence game went like this. Now rook c2, and white's plan feels quite straightforward. He has ideas like knight c4, knight a5, rook c1, and this pawn on c7 is just always weak. Objectively, this is also not so much just yet, but in correspondence between two pretty good correspondence players, white also won here, which is quite a big indication, I would say. But Rapport went for the move knight b6, which at first my engines were not even showing at all. First time I made the move, it was like plus 1.2, but then on higher depth, it understood it. So there are two possible explanations or scenarios, which I think are both quite plausible. The first one is that Rapport is just a genius. The second one is that his second, or he himself, did an absolutely fantastic job right here to come up with this idea. I'm not sure how long he knew it, but those are the only two explanations I have. So either he's a genius, or yeah, his second is, or both of them are. That's also quite likely. So knight b6, of course, attacks this pawn on c4, and now if the knight is ready to capture, of course, it's much different than if the pawn would capture. Because in the line we just saw after bc4, now this pawn is anyway going to fall, and white is recapturing it with this nice idea with knight b1. So knight b6, and now white is kind of forced to give up this this bishop with bishop takes b6. Now c takes b6 and c takes b5, a takes b5, and strategically, of course, black is in some risk, because the pawns can be weak, and also the c6 square is quite weak. But dynamically, black has a lot of play, which we also saw happen in the game. Also due to this bishop, which later on is going to be a big asset for black. King b1 was played. I was also curious about knight takes b5 here. Rook takes a2, knight ec3 is given by the computer, and after rook a8 the position is just unclear. I was clicking a bit here. It seems like black's best plan is to go bishop d7, knight d8, and knight c7, just to trade off this knight on b5, and it just feels like this king is going to be weak for quite a long time, whereas this king on g8 is enjoying quite a lot of safety. I also saw that the computer gave this move king h7, which I thought was just hilarious, but because the idea is that if white captures, there's bishop h6, and there's no way for white to stop losing the queen. So that's just a pretty cool idea, I thought. But of course, if king b1, then your rook would anyway need to retreat, so it doesn't make so much sense. So king b1 was played in the game. Now Rapport went b4, which is sort of forced. Otherwise, white can just capture the pawn. Knight b5, and here was the absolutely brilliant move which Rapport played in this position. So if you haven't seen the game and want to improve your calculation, I think this would be a great exercise, especially when it comes to like dynamic decision making. I'm definitely going to give this game to many of my students. I can already see that coming. So the move which Rapport played is the fantastic knight takes d5, which looks like it's just giving up a piece for basically nothing. But if we think a little bit more about the position, then we can see that if white captures with the queen, then there's bishop e6 with the pawn on a2 falling on the next move, and the king probably going to end up being checkmated. And if e takes d5, which was played in the game, then black has bishop f5, and this bishop is kind of pushing the king to a1, and then we can already see many threats with rook takes a2, for example. Rapport probably calculated it further or knew it further. Again, not sure about that, but even to come up with this idea is very impressive. And it's also the only way for black to keep the balance, because otherwise white is just going to capture on b4 on the next move. and then stabilize the position with knight c3, and then there's probably not much what black can do actively. So knight d5 was played, e takes d5, still the best move, bishop f5 check, king a1, and now Rapport again followed it up with the brilliant move rook a4. And his point is that, first of all, I mean, the main point is that he just needs to protect the pawn on b4, because if it would fall, then those knights have this c3 square available, which would be very important, especially for the defense of the white king, because if one knight reaches the c3 square, then the a2 pawn is protected. Also, this diagonal is going to be blocked, which I think is also an important detail. After rook a4, Pragg played knight c1, which is still a good move. The computer also gave b3, but I don't think that anyone in their right mind would play b3 here, because it just opens up this diagonal. And also here, after rook a5, queen takes b4, rook takes b5 was what the engine gave, and now queen c7. Position just looks incredibly dangerous for white, because you always need to watch out for e4. Rook a8 is also coming, so I don't think anyone would enjoy this with white. Knight c1 was played by Pragg, now queen d7, another fantastic move, bishop c4, and now rook c8. So Rapport just now activates the rest of his pieces, and understood that the queen is placed good on d7, because then this knight on b5 can often be kind of trapped as well. Rook c8, hitting the bishop on c4. Now after queen e2, Rapport played the next great move, which was e4. Quite a thematic idea, but anyway, it's beautiful, because yeah, he's just opening up this bishop on g7 finally. And this is one of the scenarios which you would love to see as a King's Indian player, that this bishop on g7 is opening up. And now, especially that white traded his dark squared bishop already, this bishop just doesn't have any counterpart which can trade it off. After e4, Pragg understandably already makes the first mistake. I have to say, it's already quite impressive how he found all of those moves until here. And he played the move bishop b3, which also looks quite logical, because you're attacking the rook on a4. But it's not leading anywhere special, because black will then anyway have rook a5, and then the knight on b5 is going to be hanging. The only two defensive moves were rook he1 and rook hf1, both incredibly difficult to find. The idea with rook f1, I think, was that if black takes, now you can take with the rook, and the rook can sometimes defend on the queen side. And if rook e1, which I analyzed a bit closer, now the point was that if black takes on f3 and goes b3, which is the typical idea, that after bishop takes b3, rook b4, knight a3, now rook a8, which would typically be the winning move here, does not work, because after knight c4, queen b5, now white can capture on d6, and the queen on e2 is protected. I think those were some of the main ideas, that now the queen is protecting, the rook is protecting the queen, because otherwise, if the knight would need to capture, then b3 would be hanging here, followed by rook takes b2 or bishop takes b2 with checkmate coming shortly. Anyway, here after knight a3, also black was holding the balance. After queen e7, knight b5, we saw quite an interesting repetition of moves. So Pragg went for bishop b3, but now after takes, rook a5, he anyway has to go back with the bishop, bishop c4, because knight d4 fails due to rook c1, and bishop takes d4. Actually, this would have been better objectively to go for a position like this, but from a practical point of view, this just seems completely hopeless for white, because this bishop is so strong. The king on g8 is incredibly safe, and black can just slowly improve the position somehow, like by bringing the queen to f6, for example, or going to rook c5 at some case, at some moment maybe. So Pragg went back bishop c4, which I think was a logical, practical decision. And here Rapport played another unbelievable move, which again, if you haven't seen it, I think you can stop the video. It's a very nice exercise. Rapport played the best move, which is bishop c2. And just out of the blue, you're putting the bishop on c2, and it's not actually clear where it is going. It does remind me of one game which Rapport had against Wesley So, actually, in Tata Steel many years ago, where Rapport also played some bishop move into the opponent's camp, where I think it was even hanging, but then he regrouped it to some better square against Wesley. So it was Queen's Indian game with Rapport with the black pieces. So if you're curious, you can check it out. So Rapport played the move bishop c2. I think there were already some other moves which gave enough compensation, but bishop c2 is in fact winning. The point is that the bishop is kind of taboo because of queen takes b5, and now black is just intending to capture back on b5, and if bishop takes b5, then rook takes c2. I meant to say black is ready to capture on c4. That's what I wanted to say. And if bishop b5, rook c2, b2 is hanging, b5 is hanging, and white is gonna get checkmated or gonna lose a lot of material. So rook d2 was Prag's move, and now bishop a4. So this was the entire idea. The bishop, in fact, looked nice on f5, but he's bringing it to a4 to try and capture this knight on b5. Prag logically went knight d4, not to give up the knight just yet, but now Rapport played another amazing move, rook c5. Because now with the knight not being on b5 anymore, you can swing this rook to the c file, where now we can see that white actually has a lot of hanging pieces there. One important point is that if b3, then Rapport would have certainly played b5, and then he's going to capture on c4 on the next move. I guess that after b takes a4, both taking with a pawn would be incredibly dangerous, but taking with a rook would also look pretty bad. Maybe rook takes c4 is even better, because after knight b3, there's b takes a4. So knight c6 was Prag's try. Now bishop takes c6, and he played knight b3. If d takes c6, queen takes c6 is going to win at least a piece back with the crushing attack. And after knight b3, rook takes c4 happened, which was, yeah, another cherry on the top. Queen takes c4, bishop to b5, and now black is only down in exchange. And the bigger problem also for white is that queen takes b4 fails because the queen is going to get trapped. Rook c4, queen a3, and rook a4. So Prag tried queen e4, but now bishop c4, another nice move, and he's just cementing the bishop on c4. And we just see the power of the bishop pair here, especially the bishop on g7, but also the bishop on c4, which is now fully anchored here. And Rapport managed to secure the win quite easily now. Knight c1 was played, rook e8. Queen a4, rook a7, queen a7. Now there's this big threat of b3 in many cases, or even bishop takes a2 could be considered in some instances. So Prag decided to give back the exchange. Queen takes c4, but now b3, another very nice move. If knight takes b3, queen f2 was winning. Maybe not the only move. Also, move like rook a8 would look quite dangerous. Queen f2 was the best objective way, because I guess there's no comfortable way of defending this pawn on b2 anymore. I guess that's also the point why he doesn't start here, because now at least white could capture this pawn right here. And after b3, with this inclusion, now there's not any queen b4, so white would have to go for some rook b1, I guess, but then you could even think about going rook e1, because white cannot capture because there's mate on b2. Rook e2 would also look incredibly bad for white, probably just lost. So Prag went rook d1, now b takes a2, queen takes a2, queen to f2, and even though the material is equal here, after queen b3, rook e3, now white actually resigned, because the king is just chronically weak. He's also probably going to drop a lot of material on the queen side, on the king side. But I think that there's just no way to stop all of the checkmate threats. Like if white would give a check, then just king h7, and there are all sorts of ideas. Like first of all, taking on f3, queen c2 would be a big threat, followed by rook a3 with checkmate. So totally understandable that Prag threw in the towel here. So anyway, I think that game was surely my favorite game of the year so far. There were already quite a few YouTube videos on that game, so I hope I could still provide some value with this game overall. Even though if you have seen it, I would probably watch many type of analysis on this game, because it's this type of game which you just cannot see enough. At least that's the way I think about it. And hopefully it's going to be some motivation for some of you to pick up playing the King's Indian. And once I publish my course on the King's Indian, it's going to be even more motivation, hopefully, to pick up the opening. So anyway, that was it for today. Once again, I hope you enjoyed today's recap. If you did, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you guys soon.